Years ago, I ran into this work by Greg Hartman, and it really touched my heart. I said, wow, this guy is down to earth and is speaking to me. I don't know if this is, I checked this out. I had to search to see if that article is still online. It's such a great article. Answers some questions. King James, people say, King James Version is the best translation because it is the most literal. And he says, and I've discovered myself, another incorrect but oft-repeated contention about the King James Version. Let me emphasize for the umpteenth time in this debate that I cherish and highly esteem the King James Version. It has not survived for 387 years up to this time, many years after that, because it's not an excellent rendition of the Scriptures. It is. 40 or 50 years ago, when other English translations began hitting the market, lots of folks said they still preferred the King James Version. I've heard that myself. Before long, the King James Version was the official translation of many institutions, and it still is. I ran into a fellow that I was attended a Bible study that I gave every week at a local church, and he was a King James only guy, and interrupted me anytime I opened up another version of the Bible. That's really rude. He could have actually opened up his own version of the King James Version, which he had, the 1611, and then read alongside of me or silently to see if what I was reading from, which was the NIV, was different, and then bring it open. I would have appreciated that, but I have to shut you down. You're not reading from the Bible. You're reading from the devil's word. Well, let's see. He wouldn't let me do it, so I had to tell him to leave the room. Soon after, the King James Version began being touted as the best English translation, period. From there, it wasn't long before folks were insisting the King James Version was the only legitimate English translation. Finally, we have those who claim the King James Version is not only the best and only legitimate English translation. Any other attempt to translate the Bible is sinful because the King James Version is actually an inspired translation. Does that sound familiar? It does with me. Anyway, in this article, I took a look at the writer's claims that the King James Version is both literal and error-free. Just take a look at the Greek. I worked with it because I purchased an interlinear years ago, and I have some. You can get some online, and you see the word order, and they give you the English underneath, so it's not a very hard thing to do. Just go get your free interlinear online. Greek is so different from English that a so-called literal translation would be unintelligible. Compare that to Young's or any other literal translation, as you will find that such works are not really literal. And he says, I have Green's literal translation myself. The grammar and syntax are rearranged and smoothed out in these translations. They have to be. It would be unintelligible. They are far less dynamic than the NIV or King James Version, but they are still not totally formal. The King James Version simply is not a literal translation. It is very, very good, but it has problems too. Did you know the Puritans and the Pilgrims refused to bring the King James Version to America with them? They said it was too idiomatic and paraphrastic. Paraphrastic. It's a combination of words together that provide a rendering in English. Take a look at paraphrastic. P-E-R-I-P-H-R-A-S-T-I-C. Now let's see what it means. Expressing or expressed in more words than are necessary, characterized by periphrase or circumulatory. For example, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that salvation not of yourselves, gift of God, not by works, lest any man should boast. Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace you have been saved, actually are saved, you to be saved. If you heard that, what would you think? This guy's been drinking something. That's the paraphrastic explanation of the verb. And if you have it literal, you're not going to get sense out of it. But actually, for by grace, you have been saved. To be saved is actually a double verb to emphasize the fact that it's a completed action with ongoing present results forever. It's an emphatic expression that you can't literally translate into English. And this happens so frequently that if you wanted a literal translation, you would find most of the stuff that you're hearing, you weren't able to put it together. So, moving on. Outright translation errors. I can give you a few examples of serious mistakes in the King James Version and some paraphrased sections. The word parbar in 1 Chronicles 26:18 is a transliteration of the Hebrew, but not a translation. They didn't translate it because it's a hapax legonomon, which means a word that only appears once in the Bible, and they didn't know what it meant. So they guessed that it was the name of a place or a city, but it's not. It means the place outside, which discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls helped ascertain. The unicorn of the King James Version, Leviticus 23:22, 24:8, and so on, should be translated wild ox. It refers to the erex, a now extinct ox that lived in Asia Minor. The King James Version translators didn't know this, so they took a stab at the word based on its etymology, horned beast, and they were wrong. And I had one guy, the guy that disrupted my class, and he kept insisting that the unicorn existed. But we just refused to believe that. The first two aren't very important, but the inclusion of Jehovah was, you see the article on God's real name, he wrote that. The word Jehovah simply does not exist. And a lot of denominational religions based on the Bible, maybe not Christian, use that word. The King James Version translators accidentally invented this word when they tried to pronounce Yahweh. Those are the four Hebrew transliterated letters to refer to the sacred name of God, Yahweh, with the vowel pointing for the word Adonai, which the Masoretes placed under Yahweh to remind rabbis and readers not to say the tetragrammaton, YHWH in English, out loud. The King James Version translators didn't know this. Western knowledge of Hebrew was not as extensive as it became later. These problems plague all translators, and the King James Version is no exception. So, an answer to the claim that the King James Version never paraphrases. Here are several examples. King James Version translators inserted the euphemism, cut themselves off in Galatians 5:17, when the Greeks really says, emasculate themselves. Further, the King James Version renders Isaiah 57:8, thou lovest their bed where thou sawest it. The Hebrew reads, you loved their couch, and at a hand you looked. They changed the noun hand into the article it to help the idiom get across. Notice that in a lot of King James Version editions, there are italic words or italicized words scattered around here and there. These words are added for clarification and are not represented in the original text. There's nothing wrong with this. Many translations add clarifying words, and it would be suitable in the English version because no two languages are alike. So they can't be translated literally, word for word or letter for letter. But a literal translation can't do that and still be literal. It becomes a paraphrase. And they see the people who go for the King James Version only denigrate other versions because they paraphrase. The issue is it accurately translated into the new language that you're reading it in a sense that makes accurate sense. In Luke 21:2, the King James Version says, the widow put in 2 mites, which are English coins. The Greek says 2 lepta. Those are ancient Greek coins. The King James Version translators knew their readers wouldn't know a lepta from a drachma, from a denarius, so they paraphrased to make sure the point got across. They did the same thing in many places. Check out Matthew 5:26, where they replaced quadrantes with farthing. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's not literal. It's a paraphrase. gives you an idea of the amount of, and what kind of money it was. In Matthew 5:38, they replaced tunic and coat with coat and cloak. 5:12 reads, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad," in the King James Version, and "rejoice and leap for joy" in the Greek. Matthew 23:6 says, "They loved the uppermost rooms at the feast," in the King James Version, and "they loved the first couch at the suppers," in Greek. But did they get the point across? Yes. Yes, but it is translated literally. No. It is paraphrased. All these examples and many, many more are paraphrases in the Greek. Yes, even in the majority text, where at the time that's the manuscript evidence they had, and they went with the majority rules because there were differences in the texts. So they went with the one that was more frequently there in different texts of the same passages. James, the brother of Jesus, is really named Jacob. No one ever admitted it. But a lot of folks think the King James Version translators changed Jacob to James as a nod to King Jimmy. If you don't believe me, get a concordance lexicon and look it up. The tradition stuck, but if you ever get a chance to look at an old great Bible, a Reams Douay, or a Tyndale and Bishop's Bible, or a Wycliffe's translation, look at the book of Jacob, not James. So the original renditions of the King James Version included the Apocrypha, by the way, which we exclude now. It's important historical information, but the differences, the difficulties, the contradictions, and errors made it unacceptable as part of the inspired Word of God, but it's historically informative. Finally, did we know the original editions of the King James Version included the Apocrypha? King James called Hampton Court to try and get all the different sects in England to stop fighting. The King James Version was the solution they came up with. Okay, if you stop fighting, we'll include the Apocrypha in the King James Version. That's not a good reason to say this is the Word of God. It was actually a revision of several earlier translations, especially Tyndale's. More than 90% of the New Testament is Tyndale's work. Isn't that interesting? Many of the scholars involved protested adding the Apocrypha because the Catholic representatives there refused to be involved without it. So they're okay, we'll include it. Well, why not the Cliff Notes or something, you know? So the King James override the Protestant translators. So King James overrided the Protestant translators. It should be a D, I guess. And ordered them to include the Apocrypha. These are just the kind of political, lexical, textual, translational problems every translation team has to deal with. It doesn't set the King James Version apart and from any other translation at all, and that's the point. The only effective difference between the King James Version and most other Bibles is that it's older. We have so many manuscript evidences, from texts that could be the original to copies that are recently thereafter in the first century and thereafter, second and third, to share and distribute amongst all the peoples of the world. And oftentimes we have letters, very often, letters that people in the first, second, third centuries that were disciples of Christ, later on after the first century, they wrote letters to one another and to their congregations, and they would quote their version of the Bible, which was much closer to the original than we have today, and they quoted it accurately. So we can reconstruct the New Testament from these letters to one another, quoting the Bibles that they used. Isn't that amazing? And you know what the differences are? Less than 1/10 of 1%. That's amazing. No other book like it. That's not really a good debating tactic, by the way. Answer to the question, do you simply refuse to believe the wide range of variants in the other texts besides the majority text? That's not really a good debate, he says. The figure is most likely from a Waite book, and I believe it is accurate. Waite has a table where he states that there is a 7% variation between Greek texts. I would have to state that your disbelief falls into the category of opinion. Opinion, yes, but informed opinion? There are about 24,000 Greek manuscripts extant right now.